previous episode, we discussed about disasters and disaster risk. Before we continue today's lesson, make sure that you have your pen, your notebook, and your self-learning module. Disasters come about because we fail to act on the natural or man-made hazards. When we fail to notice them on time, then we have a disaster risk. There is a possibility that something bad or unpleasant, such as injury or a loss, will happen. How does disaster risk come about? According to the United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, or UNISDR, the term disaster risk refers to the potential disaster losses in lives, health status, livelihoods, assets, and services which could occur in a community or society over some specified future time period. When we say potential disaster losses, we mean the product of possible damage caused by a hazard. In general, it is a combination of the probability of an event and its negative consequences. Disaster risk is often a result of the combination of the hazard, the conditions of vulnerability that are present, and the exposure or the insufficient capacity to reduce negative results or impacts. Hazard is potentially damaging physical event, phenomenon, or human activity that may cause the loss of life or injury, property damage, social and economic disruption, or environmental damage. The key words to remember here is potential and cause damage to life and property. So to understand what hazard is, we must understand that a condition has the potential to harm us or damage property. If it does not result into these two, then it is not a hazard. Vulnerability is a state of being at risk. According to Republic Act 10121, also known as Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act of 2010, vulnerability is defined as the characteristics and circumstances of a community, system, or resource that make it susceptible to the damaging effects of a hazard. Exposure refers to the degree to which a community is likely to experience hazard events of different magnitude. Example of this are those people living in the areas that gets flooded easily during typhoons, or those living at the foot of the mountains where landslides are a common thing, or it could be people living near a factory that experiences chemical leaks. Capacity, in the context of DRRM, is the capability and coping ability of schools, households, and communities to manage when disaster hits. Again, in the context of DRRM, earthquakes, floods, volcanic eruptions, landslides, droughts, tsunami, and forest fires are no longer called natural disaster, but natural hazards. It is only when we do not address the hazard and do not factor in exposure and vulnerability that we have disaster. Disaster risk equation looks like this. DR equals hazard multiplied by vulnerability over capacity. Reduction of the level of vulnerability and exposure is possible by keeping people and property as distant as possible from hazards. We cannot avoid natural events from occurring, but we can concentrate on addressing the reduction of risk and exposure by determining the factors causing disasters. Disaster risk factors are variables that either worsen or lessen the effects of hazards, affecting the degree or scope of a disaster. To tangible objects or infrastructure, like the availability of fire exits, or the sturdiness of the building, or the presence or absence of objects that can harm you or help you. Psychological factors include state of mental capacity and health. Example, are we dealing with babies, kids, adults, people with special needs? And perception of self. Example, self-assessment of capability to respond to disaster or fear. Sociocultural factors include religion, social status, traditions, perception by society. Economic factors include assets and liabilities, income, social and economic class. Political factors include government structure, diplomatic issues, the local government units. Biological factors include flora and fauna in the environment, health issues, injuries, and diseases. The damage caused by a disaster is not uniform. The determining factors of how a place can cope well with a disaster depends on its location, socioeconomic, political, and ethnical state. For example, when a typhoon hits a developing country, there is a big possibility that more deaths or more damage may occur than when a typhoon hits a developed country. Take note that a disaster is an event that has happened already, but a disaster risk is an event that has the potential to occur. Being prepared for any sudden and unpredicted disaster can reduce our fear and anxiety of the unknown. By spreading information about disasters and disaster risk, we mitigate the losses of life and property, therefore ensuring a high rate of survival and fast recovery from the damages. Did you get all that? Let us check again how well you listened to the explanation. Get your pen and your notebook and let us do a short activity.
Instructions. Arrange the given jumbled words on the screen to identify the correct terminology. The definition will help you derive the correct answer. Write your answer on your notebook. Ready? A sudden calamitous event bringing great damage, loss, destruction, and devastation. A path along the Pacific Ocean characterized by active volcanoes and frequent earthquakes. It is the shaking of Earth caused by waves moving on and below the Earth's surface. What is the answer? Type of tropical cyclone or severe tropical storm. A natural event such as a flood, earthquake, or hurricane that causes great damage or loss of life.